Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. We are diving into the Shroud of Turin today. Um, it's been called one of the most perplexing enigmas of modern times by National Geographic, no less. And you listeners have sent us some really fascinating material on this thing. So what we're really looking at here is, could this linen cloth that's been kept in Turin for centuries actually be the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth? I mean, we're talking relic versus icon here, like a direct connection versus a symbolic image. So what do you think? Where do we even begin with this thing?
Well, I think it's amazing how much attention this one piece of fabric has gotten over the centuries. We're talking scientists, historians, theologians, just tons of people really interested in it.
It's a lot for a piece of fabric.
It really is,
So let's break it down, I guess. What are we even looking at here physically?
So physically, we're looking at a linen cloth. It's about 4.4 meters by 1.1 meters. And it's a herringbone twill weave, which is kind of interesting.
Herringbone, what is that?
It's a particular type of weave where the threads make a sort of V shape. It shows a certain level of textile sophistication.
Interesting, okay.
And then, of course, there's the image.
Yeah, the image is the big thing, right?
That's what everyone's interested in. It's a faint, brownish image of a man, and it's visible on both sides of the cloth.
Front and back?
Front and back.
Oh, okay.
And you mentioned the photographic negative earlier.
Oh, yeah, that's right, I did.
That's actually super important.
Really?
Yeah, because the image is much clearer when you look at it as a negative.
Okay.
That was actually discovered back in 1898.
Wow, so like over 100 years ago.
That's right.
That's amazing.
And you know, it reveals all sorts of details, like you can see the man's beard, long hair parted in the middle. We can even estimate his height from the image, somewhere between like 1.7 and 1.88 meters.
And that negative image thing, that's kind of strange, right?
Yeah, it is.
Because people didn't even really understand photographic negatives until well into the 1800s.
Exactly.
Photography was just getting started.
Right, and that makes it really hard to swallow the idea that someone just faked it. Way back when?
Yeah, like before photography even existed.
If they were going to forge something, they wouldn't have made a negative image.
It just wouldn't make any sense.
Exactly.
So okay, we've got this image.
Yeah.
But there's also those stains everyone talks about.
Yes, the stains are absolutely crucial.
Oh, okay.
Because they seem to correspond with the wounds described in the Bible.
What kinds of wounds are we talking about here?
Well, there are marks that could be from a crown of thorns.
Okay.
Then there are these scourge marks, like from being whipped.
Wow.
Bruising on the shoulders, wounds on the hands and feet, and a wound in the side.
Like a spirit wound.
That's what it looks like, yeah.
And these are all consistent with what the Bible says happened to Jesus.
Yes, very consistent.
That's kind of spooky.
It is.
And there's more, right? Didn't scientists actually find blood in these stains?
They did. They found AB blood particles, which is a pretty rare blood type.
Oh, wow. So that kind of rules out just any random person, right?
It does make it more specific.
Okay, so we've got this image, we've got these stains. But couldn't it all just be like paint or something?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Some scientists did find iron oxide, which is a pigment.
Okay, so that supports the paint theory.
It does.
But there were other tests, right?
There were, and those tests found blood plasma and high levels of bilirubin.
And what does that tell us?
Well, bilirubin is something you expect to see in someone who suffered severe trauma.
Like from a crucifixion.
Exactly.
So that kind of contradicts the paint idea.
It does.
I mean, how would a medieval forger even know about that kind of stuff?
It's a good question. And then there's the fact that the stains correlate with the negative image.
Right, so if it was painted, why would the painter make those choices?
It doesn't really add up.
Yeah. Okay, so this thing's been around for a while.
A very long time.
And it hasn't exactly had an easy life, right?
No, it hasn't. It's been through a lot.
There was that fire I think I read about.
Oh, yes. The fire in Chambéry in 1532.
1532, wow.
It caused quite a bit of damage.
Like what kind of damage are we talking about?
There were burn marks, obviously water damage from putting the fire out, and some symmetrical holes where molten silver dripped onto the cloth.
Molten silver?
Yeah, there were silver boxes near the shroud when the fire broke out.
Oh, wow. So that's kind of like a historical marker.
It is.
It happened in 1532 for sure.
You'd know that much.
Okay, so we've got this cloth with this image, these stains, this fire damage. But where did it even come from? Like, when does it first appear in history?
Well, the first documented appearance we have is in Lille, France in the 1350s.
Good.
A knight named Geoffroy de Charny presented it to the world.
A knight, huh?
Yeah, but the problem is we have no idea where it was for the 1300 years before that.
1300 years? That's a huge gap.
It's a big mystery.
So from the 1350s to now it's been in Europe?
Right. First in France, then it went to the House of Savoy.
Okay.
And then eventually it ended up in Turin.
Where it is today.
Exactly.
And what about the church? Like, how have they viewed this thing over the centuries?
Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster.
Really?
Yeah. In 1389, a bishop actually denounced it as a forgery.
A forgery?
He claimed that an artist had confessed to creating it.
Oh, wow. But didn't the Pope at the time disagree?
He did. Pope Clement VII said it was an artistic icon.
Interesting. So even back then there was debate about it.
There's always been debate.
And what about the church today? What's their stance?
Today, they venerate it as an important icon for reflection.
Okay.
But they haven't officially said whether they believe it's authentic or not.
So they're kind of staying neutral.
You could say that.
Okay, so let's talk about the science, because there's been a lot of research on this thing.
Oh yeah, ton of scientific analysis.
And one of the biggest controversies, I think, was that carbon, dating back in 1988.
Oh yeah, that caused quite a stir.
It did. So what happened?
Well, they took samples from the Shroud and they ran carbon-14 tests. And the results came back saying the Shroud was from between 1260 and 1390 CE.
So medieval times.
Exactly.
So that means it couldn't be the burial shroud of Jesus.
That's what a lot of people thought.
But hold on, I've read that there are problems with that dating.
There are a lot of people have questioned those results.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, some scientists think the samples they tested might have been from later repairs to the Shroud.
So not the original fabric.
Exactly, and if that's true, then the dating would be off.
That makes sense. And I think I also read something about contamination.
Yes, that's another big argument.
Like what kind of contamination?
Well, bacteria, for one thing.
Bacteria can mess up carbon dating.
They can introduce carbon from different time periods.
Oh, wow.
And then there's the fire damage, remember that?
Yeah, the fire from 1532.
Right. Well, some scientists think the fire might have contaminated the Shroud with carbon monoxide.
And that would have affected the dating.
It could have made the Shroud appear younger than it really is.
Interesting. So there are definitely some serious questions about whether that 1988 carbon dating was accurate.
Absolutely. It's not a settled issue by any means.
Okay, so if that dating might be wrong, what other science is there?
Well, there's the STIRP project, for one. It stands for the Shroud of Turin Research Project.
Okay.
They did a ton of research back in 1978.
And what did they find?
Well, one of the most important findings was that there's no evidence the image was painted.
So it's not a painting.
They ruled out all sorts of things like dyes, chemicals, vapor, scorching, you name it.
Wow.
And they also confirmed that the image is of a real crucified man.
A real crucified man.
Not just some random image.
So how did the image even get there?
That's the big mystery. They couldn't figure that out.
Huh. And I think you mentioned earlier that there's been some newer research.
There has.
More recent than STIRP.
Yes, much more recent.
Like what kind of research?
Well, in 2022, a team of scientists used X-ray scattering to study the Shroud.
X-ray scattering.
Okay. And what they found was really interesting.
What did they find?
They found that the structural degradation of the linen was consistent with a first century origin.
So that would mean the Shroud is from the time of Jesus.
Exactly. And it supports the idea that contamination might have messed up the carbon dating.
Oh, wow. So maybe that carbon dating was wrong after all.
It's possible.
And are there any other recent studies we should know about?
Yes, actually some even newer research just came out this year in 2024.
Oh, wow. What's that about?
Well, one study looked at the bloodstains on the Shroud in a lot of detail, and they found that the patterns of the stains, the way the blood flowed, the types of blood particles, all of that was incredibly consistent with the gospel accounts of Jesus' torture and crucifixion.
So it's like forensic evidence from 2,000 years ago.
It's pretty amazing. And then there's this other theory that's gotten some attention.
Okay, what's that?
It's the idea that the resurrection itself might have affected the carbon dating.
The resurrection?
Yes. The theory is that some kind of intense neutron radiation occurred at the time of the resurrection.
And how would that affect the carbon dating?
Well, it could have altered the carbon-14 levels in the Shroud.
Making it appear younger than it really is?
Exactly.
So that would mean the carbon dating is unreliable.
That's what the theory suggests.
Wow, so we've got all this history, all this science, But for a lot of people, this is more than just a puzzle.
It's true. For many people, this is deeply religious.
Yeah.
For many Christians, they believe this is the actual burial shroud of Jesus.
The cloth that wrapped his body after he was taken down from the cross.
Yes, and the image is like a direct imprint of his body bearing the marks of his suffering.
Wow.
And, popes have even called it a mirror of the gospel.
So they really revere it.
They do. They see it as a powerful symbol of Christ's passion.
Even if they haven't officially declared it authentic.
Right.
So what about other Christian traditions? Like, what do evangelicals think about the shroud?
Well, there are different views. Some evangelical scholars see it as potentially authentic.
Yeah.
They point out that the image is consistent with Jewish burial practices and with the gospel accounts.
Right.
But other evangelicals are more skeptical.
What makes them skeptical?
Well, they point to the carbon dating and the fact that the image isn't explicitly mentioned in the New Testament.
Okay, so there's no mention of a miraculous image.
Not in the Bible.
And ultimately, for most Christians, faith isn't based on relics, right?
Exactly.
It's about a relationship with Jesus.
Right.
Okay, so let's try to sum this all up. If we're weighing the evidence for and against the shroud's authenticity, what are the main points on each side?
Well, on the side of authenticity, you've got the fact that the details of the image and the stains match up with the biblical accounts.
Right.
And then there's the fact that it's a negative image, which is really strange.
Yeah.
And the Sturt finding is that it's not a painting and that it's the image of a real crucified man. And then you've got the AB blood type, which is relatively rare. And the pollen evidence that some researchers say connects it to the Holy Land.
Okay, so that's a lot of evidence pointing towards it being real.
It is.
But what about the other side? What are the arguments against authenticity?
Well, the biggest one is that 1988 carbon dating.
Right.
That's a major hurdle for people who believe it's authentic.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the historical gap, the fact that we don't know where it was for 1,300 years.
Yeah.
And then you've got the fact that it was initially denounced as a forgery back in the 1300s.
Okay.
And some people have also questioned the proportions of the image and the posture of the man.
Like they don't look quite right.
Some people think so, and of course there's the whole question of whether the stains are really blood or just pigment.
Right.
Some researchers still maintain that it's pigment, even though there's evidence pointing to blood.
And then some people say the Bible doesn't even mention an image.
Right, it doesn't explicitly describe a burial cloth with an image of Jesus.
So that's another point against authenticity. So it seems like we're kind of left with more questions than answers.
In some ways, yes.
What are some of the big debates that are still going on?
Well, the biggest one, I think, is about the carbon dating.
Okay.
Whether it's reliable or not.
Versus those newer scientific findings.
Exactly.
And then there's the whole question of how the image was formed.
Right.
No one really knows for sure.
It's a mystery.
And then there's that 1,300-year gap.
The missing years.
Yeah, where was it during all that time?
No one knows.
And of course, the debate about blood versus pigment is still going on.
It is.
And then there's a whole question of how you balance the scientific evidence with religious belief.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Some people see the shroud as proof of their faith,
Okay.
while others say faith shouldn't depend on physical evidence.
So a lot of different perspectives.
Many different perspectives.
So, okay, where is the shroud today, and is there any research still happening?
It's currently housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, in a special chapel called the Chapel of the Holy Shroud.
And it belongs to the Catholic Church.
It does.
They don't put it on display very often, though, do they?
No, it's only displayed on very rare occasions.
But there's still research going on.
Right, yeah. There's always new research being done.
Like what?
Well, we talked about those 2022 and 2024 studies.
Yeah, the X-ray scattering and the bloodstain analysis.
Exactly, and there was even a recent exhibition at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it just opened last year, actually in February of 2022.
So people are still really interested in this thing.
They are. It continues to fascinate people all over the world.
So, okay, let's zoom out for a second and look at this from a bigger perspective. If we consider the historical, the scientific, and the religious angles, what's the overall picture here?
Well, historically, I think we see a movement from skepticism to veneration.
Okay.
In the beginning, there was a lot of doubt about the shroud's authenticity.
Like with that bishop who denounced it as a forgery?
Yeah. Exactly, but over time, it became more and more important as a religious relic, especially for the House of Savoy.
Right, they really promoted it.
They did, and then with the discovery of the negative image in the late 1800s, that's when the scientific inquiry really took off.
That makes sense. People wanted to understand how that image got there.
Exactly, and there's also been this debate about whether the shroud is connected to another famous relic called the Dandelion.
The Dandelion, what's that?
It was supposedly a cloth with an image of Jesus's face that existed in the early centuries of Christianity.
Oh, wow. So maybe the shroud is actually a piece of that cloth.
Some people believe that, but it's still very much debated.
Okay, so that's the historical perspective.
Yeah.
What about the scientific perspective?
Well, from a scientific point of view, the evidence is really complicated.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
You've got some evidence that supports authenticity, like the blood stains, the pollen, but then you've got that 1988 carbon dating, which suggests it's a medieval forgery. And even though there are questions about that dating, it's still a big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And then the biggest scientific mystery of all is how that image got there.
Yeah.
Scientists have ruled out all the obvious explanations, like painting or scorching, but they haven't been able to come up with a definitive answer.
So it's still an enigma.
Absolutely.
And then what about the religious perspective?
Well, religiously, the Shroud of Turin is incredibly significant.
Yeah.
For many people, it's a tangible reminder of Jesus' suffering and death.
Right.
It allows them to connect with his humanity in a really powerful way.
And the Catholic Church encourages that veneration.
They do.
Even though they haven't officially said whether they believe it's authentic or not.
Exactly. They say it's an important icon for reflection on Christ's passion.
But they don't say it's a relic.
No, they leave that open to individual interpretation.
Interesting.
And then, of course, you have the different views within other Christian traditions, like evangelicalism.
Right. Some people see it as potential proof of the resurrection,
while others say it's not necessary for faith.
So a lot of diversity of thought.
A lot of diversity.
Well, it seems like the Shroud of Turin really is a fascinating and complex subject.
It is.
It's a place where history, science, and faith all intersect.
That's a great way to put it.
And even after all this discussion, we're still left with a lot of unanswered questions.
We are.
I mean, scientific and historical analysis definitely raises some challenges to the claim that this is actually the burial cloth of Jesus.
It does.
But at the same time, its religious significance and the mystery of the image, those continue to capture people's imaginations.
Absolutely.
And in the end, I think how you interpret the shroud really comes down to personal conviction.
I agree.
It's up to each individual to decide what they believe.
So that's it for our deep dive into the Shroud of Turin. But I do want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the evidence and the arguments, but I think it's also worth asking ourselves, why are we so drawn to an object like this?
That's a great question. What is it about the Shroud of Turin that continues to fascinate us after all these centuries?
I think it speaks to our human desire to connect with the past.
Okay.
To touch something that might have been touched by someone so important.
Like Jesus.
Yes, and I think it also reflects our need to find tangible evidence for our beliefs.
Even when those beliefs are ultimately based on faith.
Exactly. The shroud is a physical object that we can see and touch. And for some people, that makes their faith feel more concrete.
So maybe it's not just about the evidence itself, but about what the shroud represents.
I think that's a big part of it.
Our need to connect the physical world with our deepest beliefs.
Exactly.
Well, that's something for all of us to ponder. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. And until next time, keep exploring.